You're listening to My Inner Teacher with Peter Starius and Crystal Ariel. The answers you seek are within you.
Welcome, Andrew. Thank you so much for responding to my request to be a guest on our show. And I want to start by just remembering my first experience of you at the Sedona Yoga Festival, how my wife and I had been walking by your booth for at least a day, and there was always all these people, the only booth really that had any people around it, and you were doing drumming lessons. And I wouldn't call myself a drummer, but I love drumming, and it was just like, I got to find time in my schedule to get over to that booth. And when I got to your booth, you were swarmed by people. And then I picked up your book, Sacred Seven, and I couldn't put it down. So let's start there. Tell me about this early experience you have with the concepts in the Sacred Seven. Was that a part of your upbringing, part of your culture, or did you discover it later in life?
So I'd love to introduce myself here in my traditional
Yes,
language.
please.
So Dagote she inde Andrew Ecker Yenishe Adona e Nishinigi e inde Nishe Irish Bashachin inde Dashache German Dashanami Kote Goe Itishli e Portland, Oregon Inisha Shema e Kathy Lindsay Woye Shaza e Del Ecker Wole. My name is Andrew Ecker. My mother, Kathy Lindsay. My father, Dale Ecker. My mother's mother, Elba Gallegos, Apache woman from New Mexico. She grew up in a little town called Capitan, right outside the Mescalero Reservation, where my mom was raised as well. Although my ancestral lines go back to the Madera Valley of Texas and Chihuahua, Mexico. The Apaches from this borderland are called Lapon Band Apache. My father's mother, Evelyn Beatty, an Irish woman from Pennsylvania, she was very proud that our ancestor, William Beatty, fought in the Revolutionary War to establish this country. My mother's father, Leroy Lindsay, a Korean and Vietnam War veteran, and my father's father, Wayne Ecker, a World War II veteran. I have a daughter, Bailey, a son, Peyton, and a beloved fiance named Monica. I was born in the ancestral land of the Multnomah, Clackamas, and Willamette in Portland, Oregon, although I currently reside in the ancestral land of the Akmel Atum, the Peepash, and the Maricopa. And the Hohokam here in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona area. So that's who I am. And this formal introduction, what I would say a ceremonial introduction, was definitely not a part of my life for many years. I grew up in a home where both my parents were addicted to drugs. My mom died of a cocaine overdose, and my father died of cirrhosis of the liver caused by hepatitis C. So growing up in that environment, the idea of ceremony, ritual, really spirituality, wasn't something that was a part of my upbringing. But fortunately, through the power of drumming as a wellness intervention, I was able to get introduced with a powerful form of self-identity that I wrote a book on called The Sacred Seven. So this has really recalibrated my ideas of who I am and helped to restructure others in the way that they view themselves. There's three really major institutions that have created forms of self-identity that we have today that are really woven into kind of the air we breathe, and definitely affect us on a subconscious level. The patriarchy, manneralism, and feudalism. And these institutions have created a systematic separation from us and the land, and our family for many years. You'll note that there are very few people that have a land-based identity in our contemporary culture. Many people have a name that's associated with a job: the smith, the parson, the knight. These are names that are synonymous with behaviors. And that behavioral model of self-identity is integrated into many aspects of our contemporary culture, including something as significant as health. Myself, growing up the way I grew up, I had a struggle with substance use disorder and live in relationship to that aspect of myself. But I remember, being told as a young person trying to find my way to recovery that I am an addict. And that never really sat well with me. But yet we go to many different forms of recovery and people will introduce themselves. Hi, my name is Andrew and I'm a addict. And this behavioral model of self-identity is so infiltrated into our everyday life, and sometimes we don't know how it's showing up. But it was very important for me to unravel that, to find a sense of foundation. And I think that there's many different organizations that have a really strong reasoning behind that. I mean, there's so many books of the Bible, right, that have a begot so and so, and within the yogic and many Asian cultures throughout the world, the idea of honoring your ancestors is just innate. It's just something you do as a part of your practice. Yet in our distorted contemporary culture, we've gotten away from that. And in doing so, we've really alienated ourselves from the air, the water, the fire, the earth, and these very powerful relatives that we experience. The mountains, the rivers, the valleys, these are all our relatives. And the Sacred Seven is about getting back to that. So I definitely remember our interaction. You're one of the people that I had a heartfelt connection with out of the many that were flocking in and out of our booth. I definitely felt you, Peter, and I'm very grateful to be here to support your service through getting this information to the world. So thank you for allowing me to share.
I was so excited for this opportunity. So thank you for being here. What we've done with this podcast, Andrew, is an idea that's blossomed into hopefully a community. And that community is people that come to some realization that's beyond what they were taught. And they move into this unknown space where they listen to voices. And those voices have names. The names that I've given it is this inner teacher that speaks to me. The question I have for you is, with this book, it sounds like you have more than one voice that you listen to when you look inside. You've got all your ancestry, the Sacred Seven ancestry. So tell me about that. Like, is your inner navigator, as you move through this physical life, is it a single voice? Is it multiple voices? Is it the nature? I mean, help our listeners understand what the process is like for you with your culture.
You talked about how, the education of ourselves sometimes creates influence, and then finding this direct access to this voice, this inner guidance. For me, that idea of how I was educated in my life to create an idea of my self-identity is very important to the process of unraveling the confusion of the illusion. So I grew up during the height of the Reagan administration, way back in the 1900s. And during this time, there was something they called the war on drugs. And the war on drugs was really a war on people. And this idea of eradicating substance use disorder or mental illness from our culture through violence was something that I lived through. I lived through a no-knock warrant, basically police forcing themselves into my home as a child to arrest my mom. There was also television shows that, news articles that were really creating this propaganda against this evil villain, were these people with mental health concerns. And that was my family. I remember my mom was watching television and they had this huge segment on the DARE program. And they said that the DARE program was getting children to turn in their parents for using cannabis. And this caused a lot of grief in my mom and a lot of paranoia. She was very concerned that I was going to be interrogated. And I remember her telling me that if they asked if we were using cannabis, that I needed to tell them that you didn't know what that was and that wasn't a part of our life. And this was really odd to me, Peter, because these were the times that my parents were actually functional, is when they were using cannabis. The alcohol and the other substances, there wasn't really any sort of family experiences, but when they were medicating themselves with cannabis, they were playing music, they were, a part of my life as a child, and I just thought it odd. Yet I remember that fateful day when the DARE program came into my school and they were waving flags, and, these are big, burly police officers, they had guns, and, I'm just a fourth grader, and I remember being terrified. Thinking that at any moment I was going to be put into a room and interrogated. Well, they didn't do that, thankfully. But they did say to this group of children living in Southeast Portland. Now, Southeast Portland at that time looked like a bunch of VW buses broke down and Harley Davidsons, and they made a treehouse. I mean, that was literally what my neighborhood was. These were the children of the 70s and 60s counterculture movement that had integrated into Southeast Portland. My family was unique because we were New Mexico transplants that moved into a very low income area of Portland, where the housing was affordable. But my friends had tie-dye in their doors. They had, it was a totally different lifestyle. To say what they said to a group of children was definitely something that was thought about. And they said, if you have one drug addict parent, you're 50% more likely to become a drug addict. Now, mind you, I wasn't a physicist or a mathematician, but I knew what 50 and 50 was. And I remember feeling this sense of heaviness, a density flow over me. And even as I'm sharing this, I'm kind of reliving that experience as a boy. And I remember that there was a seed that was put into my mind of acceptance that that's what I was, that I was this idea of the behaviors of my parents, that I was genetically flawed because of their behaviors, and I was destined to this reality. Now, it wasn't until years later that actually manifested in my life, and the captivity of my mind created a captivity to substance use and then a captivity to incarceration. Yet that principle of captivity to an architecture of self-identity that really was imparted to me created an education that was distorted and an illusion that I had to really unravel. And I found that unraveling while I was sitting in a hogan on the Navajo Nation. And these elders came into this ceremony. I was invited to do a conference. It was a healers conference, very eclectic group of people. There were people there from all over the world, and it was done at the Fort Defiance Hospital on the Navajo Nation. So there were contemporary doctors, there were naturopaths, there were energy healers, all different types of folks. And we were all sitting in this hogan, shoulder to shoulder. And just when everybody was in there, this kind of delegation of elders from the Navajo community came in, and they all sat down. And the medicine man, his name was Fillmore Bluehouse, he was giving us an education on the Navajo teachings. And he opened the ceremony up by asking if any of his relatives would like to introduce themselves. And they all introduced themselves from their family, from their clans. And Peter, I thought, what does that mean? Right. What does that mean to introduce yourself as your grandma and your grandpa? To introduce yourself as your mom and your dad? I had never heard anything like this before. And that inner voice that you talk about, that inner voice that has more questions than answers, arose inside of me and started to question the foundations of my reality, of all of this struggle that I had created, this overcoming, this need to somehow transcend the destruction of my ancestry. And at that moment, I think I found a seed, a new seed that was put in my heart. And I began to realize my medicine. At that point, my medicine was the drum and sound. And I had been invited there to do this drum circle, and all these elders from the community. There was 200 people at the drum circle that I facilitated. They were all there, and yeah, that was important. But what I found was the deepness of the richness of the medicine of who I am. Why I incarnated into this body, why this soul said to the Creator, in my opinion, hey, I want to help people reconnect to the wisdom of the earth. I want them to connect to the heartbeat. Look at those people down there. I said to the Creator, they've gone some way astray. What can we do together to help them? And the Creator said, oh, well, I have an assignment for you. Your mom's going to use you to steal as a little boy. She's going to use you to shoplift. Your dad's going to he's going to think being a good dad is turning you on to a clean heroin connection. You're going to do heroin with your father. You're going to be incarcerated on the same prison yard as you watched your father incarcerated on. You're going to go through all these things in your life. And I said to the Creator, sign me up. I'm ready to do this. And, it's been a great awakening to get me to that place of being grateful for my life, of understanding that my PTSD is no longer my PTSD. It's a relationship that I have. It's a part of me, and it's something that I'm using today to help people in drug and alcohol treatment facilities. Yes, I go in with the drum, and yes, I go in with the gong and the chimes and the Tibetan singing bowl and the teachings of the Sacred Seven and all these influences that are based around earth-based wisdom. but ultimately my medicine, and I think this is true for all great people that are called to this path of service, is that our medicine is much more than the instrument of our service. Our medicine is what's inside of us. You know, that yearning to give people a practice, to open them up to a way of life. You know, and fortunately, I've been able to be a keynote presenter at some of the most influential organizations in healthcare, including the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine. I presented there, the North American Primary Care Research Group. I mean, there's a whole list. But understanding that principle of medicine is a very important part of what I think is evolving ourselves into a service mentality and really living our authenticity.
Do you remember after we first met and after I drummed in your circle, what happened the next time we connected at that festival?
Hey, quick note. Peter's Inner Teacher Academy is launching soon. If this is resonating with you, head over to innerteacheracademy.com and grab a spot on the waitlist. These trainings are intimate and space is limited. So if you want to be first in line, tap the link in the description below and sign up.
You can also see details about my 2025 retreats at some incredible locations around the world, like Iceland, Austria, California, and New Zealand. Attendance at these trainings will count towards in-person hours for the Inner Teacher Academy. And now let's get back to the magic.
You know, I just remember our heart space that we connected. You talked about your body. You talked about what you had been through. And, you know, I understood that in front of me is a person that understands their medicine, that you took your story that you've gone through in your life and you began to help people understand themselves through empathy, through the connection that you have. So specifically, my heart is, I wish I could go to that specific moment again, but that was the nature of, yes, please.
You came and listened to my talk, and it was during a book signing for my new book.
I remember now, yeah.
Filled with excitement with my book, and you just were in the back and listening, and I saw you there, and I thought, wow, he came, you know, that's so nice. And then after that, you came up to me and you kind of basically said, the way you're introducing yourself is not adequate for who you are, something like that. And I want to teach you the way to recognize your ancestry as you move through life. And I hadn't started reading your book yet. I just kind of paged through it in your booth. That conversation you had with me afterwards motivated me to finish that book. And I finished the whole book on the flight home back to California. I was so taken by your journey, by the insight that you had gathered, and then that powerful recognition of your ancestry that has stayed with me since that moment I met you. I've had an intuition about my ancestry, but I actually took the effort to find out who these 7 people were, and that was powerful for me. So thank you for that.
I have a question for both of you. And Andrew, I love that when I was reading about you, you have this Native American, like Apache ancestry, but you also have like this Irish German side. And then Peter, you have Greek and you have German, and I have Cuban and Irish German. And so for me, and those two feel very different, right? So I wonder if I'm feeling this way, there's got to be other people feeling like, but I don't just come from one place. And often I feel like I have to pick one. And I don't want to pick one, so I end up picking none, and I walk around like I don't have any ancestry, and I'm just like a brand new being in this brand new world. But what does ancestry look like when your lineage is mixed?
Yeah, I think, so the idea of clan identity is something that's synonymous with the idea of mix. You know, within the traditional cultural system, it would be clans that would be represented inside of your your grandparents. So each one of those clans would be represented in the feminine side, the maternal side. So in the Apache tradition, which is synonymous with many earth-based traditions, you are your mother's mother. Your father is his mother. And then the maternal line creates that association. So your grandfathers are their mother. And that really creates this idea of the wholeness of who you are as a person, and the importance of mixing, because one of the reasons why people introduce their clans is so that they don't have inner relationships, that they don't have clan having a baby with the same clan. So the idea of being mixed is a very important premise of being whole. Now, when we create this concept of cultural identity, right? That idea of cultural identity sometimes becomes something that's so great that in our contemporary culture, we don't really know how to assimilate all of these different processes into our everyday being. But for me, I think it's important that those of us that are called to awaken in our relationship with the earth, awaken our relationship with our family, is that we introduce them. You know, we introduce our grandparents and our parents, because how beautiful it would be one day for your daughter to be at your favorite place in nature and sitting around the fireplace and have the glow of the fire in her eyes, and her look up with that glowing fire and introduce herself as you. You know, this has been a part of Earth-based communities since the dawn of cultural identity, and we've gotten systematically away from that. There's a responsibility also within that, because the model of self-identity creates responsibility to your brother's children are now your children. Your the way that you show up within the system of the organization of the community is a way of responsibility as well. You know, these are all integrated parts of creating functional earthlings. And it's so important that we, as people that are striving towards rekindling our relationship with the earth, look at the premises of what earth-based communities have done since time immemorial to create healthy people. There's a reason why organizations throughout the world, communities throughout the world recognize their ancestors. There's a huge understanding of the importance of that. In Jewish communities, when you go to the synagogue, a person that invited you to that synagogue would introduce you as your family. They would introduce your parents and your grandparents as you. Because of that, in the Maori community in New Zealand, they would introduce your family, the mountain of your birth, and the river of your birth, because the mountain and the river were significant to who you are. You know, all of these ideas are important to creating the foundation of functional human beings. We have created a culture that hyper focuses on behavior. And we create institutions that can take those behavioral models of self-identity from us. You know, as a teacher, yoga teacher, you're given a certificate of yoga, that you're a 200-hour yoga certified teacher. There's an institution that holds the governance of that certificate, but yet that's woven into the fabric of so many people's identity. And it has so much merit to who they are because of the lack of a familial and earth-based foundation. You know, these behaviors are very important because healthy behaviors create healthy people. But what is the foundation for the system of health? How do we create integrative communities? How do we look at a holistic approach to wellness that is beyond the individual, but into the practice of creating a very functional relationship to our planet? You know, these are the questions that the Sacred Seven answers. So, yes, I understand that ism. I understand having an intimate relationship with a woman that I don't know her grandmother's name. This is how distorted I've lived my life. I've lived a life like that, where I've had intimate sexual relationships with people and I don't know their parents' name. You know, that's how crazy we are right now. We have people that tell us that I've come into contact with and they said, well, I don't want to introduce my parents because I've been hurt by them. It's not easy for me to introduce my parents either, but understanding that that's the product of the medicine that I have. I don't understand what it's like to have a parent force me to go to college when I want to dance. I don't understand what it's like to have a parent force me to be an accountant when all I want to do is play guitar. I don't know that story, but I know there's medicine in that story for someone else. And when you come to balancing your relationship with your parents, these 7 guides that we talk about in the Sacred Seven, you find the authenticity of your medicine in a very profound way. And so I hope that shares a little bit about the fragmentation of how we show up in our contemporary culture and why these principles of self-identity are so important to a healthy narrative.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what Peter, like what do you think about that?
I have an experience that's entirely different in a way, but when I met Andrew, I was at a point in my life where there were pieces that were missing. I could feel the pieces missing, and I had made a certain effort to reconnect. I was the first person in my family to go back to both Germany and to Greece to meet what relatives I was aware of there. In Germany, it was harder because there were no records. And I don't think I ever really truly met anyone that had lineage, bloodline with me, but I met people in the town where my mom's parents grew up. In Greece, it was different. And it was very satisfying when I was a younger man. Before I met you, Andrew, it was very satisfying to see and hear the stories of the immigration to the United States and the pain and suffering that was caused before that decision and after that decision to leave their ancestry. But it really came home to me last summer when I took my daughter to Greece for the first time. And Andrew, I was thinking about you, and even more so now that we're talking, how powerful it was for me to see my daughter connecting with a second or third cousin that looked like a twin sister, same age, on a little remote Greek island near the Turkish coast, which is right opposite where my grandparents, the village in Turkey is the village of my grandparents. And I was just, I mean, the inner teacher is so much so the heart, and that's where you and I connected, at that heart space. And my heart was just wide open there. And that experience last summer has changed my relationship with my daughter in a good way. Like it's just, she belongs. She can see what family line she belongs to. The German side of the family, I don't know if that's ever going to really happen, but there are pictures and things that we can imagine their lives were like. But yeah, no, it's just another reminder for me of the voice that speaks has influence within myself, has influence from every ancestor I'm aware of, and even some of the ones that I'm not aware of. And I feel grateful.
I love that. I love that so much. When I share the practice of the Sacred Seven with people, I encourage them to use the limitless aspect of the introduction of their grandparents and their parents. So, for instance, instead of saying, my mother was Kathy Lindsay, I say, my mother is Kathy Lindsay. I say, my grandmother is Elva Gallegos. And what this does is this really creates that kind of endless idea of connection. And there's something etherical and very spiritual about speaking their names. When we speak their names or we honor them. Now, what would a person that's adopted do? Well, the adoption way is a practice also that's very important to self-identity, because that lineage that's given and granted to us through those adopted relatives is just as powerful as our biological family. And what I was interested in when I was writing the book was this idea of how did adoption look like in a traditional sense. Well, the elders that I talked to, they said if you didn't know how to introduce yourself, you were called abandoned. And immediately I thought, oh, like shunned by the community? And the elders said, no, not at all. Like, we must give you those names. It's our responsibility as the community to be your grandparents, to be your parents, and to be honored by you as a child. And we have this misconception today of children. We have hundreds, thousands of children in foster care right now that are coming from horrible situations, and our community lacks the infrastructure of the village to create a vehicle for those important pieces of self-identity to be established. I once fostered 3 children, and I can tell you it is such an empowering experience to be able to fulfill that need within a child and to be a mentor for them and to impart to them the wisdom that you've been granted. In some ways, there's a closeness to them that resembles your biological children, but it's also a deep connection in a spiritual way. And I think that that principle that the elder taught me of responsibility for our culture's children, our most vulnerable and precious gift, is a very important part of realizing how these principles of self-identity, familial and earth-based identity, can create a very powerful cultural aspect of how we show up. So, you know, this deep concept of how these parts of ourselves that we integrate, you know, so many deep stories come from this. You know, the story of you and your daughter. I mean, I was there with you as you were talking about that. I could see your daughter looking into the eyes of this twin sister, for, you know, long lost twin sister, and understanding that the mountains calling you home, the island calling you home. You know, this is about that idea of how there's a genetic impartation through the land itself. The land is imparted to our DNA. And when we go back to those places where we had that epigenetic response happen, there's something that gets calibrated inside of us, you know, something that happens to our DNA. And these sorts of pilgrimages are very important. There's so many people that, you know, why is it that there's Mecca? You know, why is it that there's the Wailing Wall? You know, why is it that the temples in the Himalayas are significant? Because these are places that have created mystic stories, but there's also an epigenetic response to those actual pinpoints on the map, that people have a genetic conditioning to those places. And this is a very powerful, profound aspect of this earth-based identity system that you innately knew was a value, that you wanted to share with your children. You know, and why is it that we get to a certain place in our lives and we wake up to asking these deep questions, and we allow for that inner guide to come forward to answer them, to say, go back to the island of your ancestors, go back to the valleys, go back to the mountains of your ancestors, visit those places. You know, I yearn for the petroglyphs. I yearn for those. I go visit them when I need rejuvenation. I go to the mountains of my ancestors here in North America, and I introduce myself to the mountains. I introduce my family to the mountains, to the rivers. You know, that is something that is a part of me, but there's also a part of me that yearns for the mountains of Ireland, yearns for the mountains of Germany. You know, I want to do what you've done, Peter, and I'm hoping that there'll be a point in my life where I'll be able to do that. It's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story.
You're welcome.
I have another question for both of you, and maybe we could start with Peter this time. Since this is about my inner teacher, I've been thinking my inner teacher is like God, or like the spirit version of me, or this one entity. But then, you know, sometimes when I pray or meditate, I call in my ancestors. And so I want to know, like, is the inner teacher the spiritual you, or just God, or is it also your ancestors, or like, does it change?
I haven't been able to label it what I call my inner teacher. I just see remnants of the inner teacher show up in my life. What does that mean? There are certain circumstances that and this is what I learned on my yoga mat, where the areas in my body that were physically or mentally out of balance created a resistance to what called normal movement, that I felt limited by something physical or something psychological. And the early me, the early immature, in a way, yoga student would look at those situations as challenges to conquer, you know, to like take charge and work through it until I broke my back. Once I broke my back, it wasn't like I was going to work through the broken back. I had to work with the broken back. And this is where the shift came. And Andrew, I really liked what you said earlier about these opportunities to take suffering and turn it into a gift. Like this trauma that we may have experienced in life actually is the medicine. It is It is that voice of experience that comes through being in that situation, even if it's beyond, in my experience, it was beyond anything I had ever learned, or there was no one else when I broke my back. There was no one there to coach me. What workshop do I go to help me fix my broken back? So resistance became a gift. It took my attention into areas of my body and mind that were out of balance. And so the soft voice inside that I hear often is when I'm experiencing in life, either on a yoga mat or off. This is a confrontational situation. This is a place where I can't move with freedom. How do I live in relationship to what I can't move with freedom into? And that to me is the gift, the opportunity to, how do I find balance? The first step is acknowledging that there's a relationship potential in that experience. So when I meet resistance in my body, it isn't like I got to get rid of it as quickly as possible. It's like, oh, this is going to be interesting. Let's see what happens. And what happens physically on a yoga mat, or what happens psychologically on a yoga mat, or what happens physically. Here's an example of what happens physically in life. I'll be at the dentist's office and there'll be a book on this just happened. There'll be a book on the table next to the waiting room that just has exactly what I needed to read in that moment. What is that about? How does that?
But is that coincidence, or are those your ancestors?
Good question. Coincidence, as I've mentioned, comes from this root word coincide, which means two things that fit perfectly together. And yet our use of the word coincidence is some rare situation that almost it's impossible for it to happen. And no, it's actually meant to happen. It's meant to be there. And do I need to label it? I don't. I just make note of it. I see a situation that has shown up for me on the external realm, and then I kind of immediately look inward, like, note to self. This is an opportunity to see what expansion in this situation is possible. So I trust that now. I'm in a place where I have this relationship. We've talked about this before, Crystal, with a relationship with what many people would call the divine, some spiritual experience of living that's influenced by a higher source of intelligence. And I don't have a tribal culture to lean on until I met Andrew, and he opened me up to the idea that I do have a tribal influence. I can imagine these people and the sacrifices that they made to create lives for their children and their children's children. And that is now part of me, and that's an awareness in me. And it's an awareness that I want to share with my children and my children's children, if that comes about. So there's this idea of inner teacher that I'm so familiar with now that I'm grateful for it. I don't necessarily, I know the qualities of how it shows up in my life. It shows up most when I'm still, when I'm quiet, or when I'm resting, and the mind is not preoccupied with busyness. And in those moments, sometimes it literally is words that are speaking to me, like a voice inside, and it's registering on the inner ear. Other times it's just being in nature and feeling the awness, the expansiveness of nature that's like medicine. So yeah, that's how I would answer it.
Yeah. What's your take, Andrew?
Oh, it's such a beautiful question. It's such a great answer, Peter. I love the concept of relationship is something that is very meaningful to me. We have a saying, all my relations, we say in the Sweat Lodge. This is such an expansive way of viewing reality. And when we step into relational spirituality, we can give ourselves permission to explore the relationship, to create boundaries, to look at how we can better serve that relationship, how we can be served by the relationship, what the authenticity and vulnerability that we're exploring, and how the relationship manifests itself. So I've taken that concept and utilized it in many aspects of my life to create a sort of healthy idea of how I show up. So it feels really good to hear that language from you. You're definitely in a path that is bringing forward a deep conscious commitment to striving towards optimization. And what's so beautiful about relational optimization is that it's awareness. It's not perfection; it's practice. Like being a father is a practice. Being a child is a practice. Being a man, being a woman, being a human is a practice. All of these different variables are so comfortable when we give ourselves that language. So to get to the question, if we look at source as this divine sort of energy relationship, we can say that within that relationship there are aspects of the source energy.
I mean, we could talk for another 3 hours. I have a sense, Andrew, of comparing our stories of coincidence and what I call it. You know what I call this, what you're talking about? A miracle. And then this word miracle is so beautiful. In the opening of my book, I borrowed a quote from an author, and I should remember her name so that I don't forget it. But her quote is, "Miracles are nature unimpeded." And for me, just what you're saying, it's like we're supposed to live a life full of miracles. That it's nature, it's what surrounds us, and on a yoga mat, it's also what dwells within us. Because the environment, the natural environment on the exterior has its microcosm within. And when we start to think of our bodies as, like Bruce Lipton's work about, our body is a cooperative strategy of 40 trillion cells for survival, and that's this community that's been through evolution fine-tune different types of cells to create different functions to maintain this vehicle that we're traveling in optimally. And when you really hold that, it's a heart-filled space. It's a space that has love on every level. Thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. And I'm lucky because in 2 weeks, I'm going to see you in Sedona. Thank you so much, Andrew.
That's it for this episode. Be well and stay open to the teacher within. If you've enjoyed our time together, follow or subscribe and stay tuned for upcoming chats you don't want to miss.